Hello and welcome to the Stuw, a podcast where we explore a variety of topics each week, either youth ministry, because I'm a youth pastor, church, life, philosophy, theology, what have you. I am Josh Klein, the youth pastor at Crosspoint Bible Church, and welcome into the Stuw today. Hopefully you had a chance to check out last week's interview with Marilyn Busenitz during your Memorial Day activities. I thought it was enlightening and had a fun time doing it, so thank you, Marilyn, for doing that once again. And if you haven't been able to listen to it, go back and listen to it. In fact, I encourage you, if this is your first time listening to the podcast, go back and listen to at least the pilot episode to get the goal and the vision for this podcast. If not, other ones I would recommend is why COVID-19 is a good one. Basically get into why God would allow evil or sickness in the world. Just take a look at some of those and let me know what you think. So if you remember the pilot, if you listen to it, we talked about every fourth week, so the ending of every month, we would talk about a big question. Sometimes it's something theological, maybe philosophical, society in general, whatever. I have plenty of ideas, but I'd like to hear from you too. So if you have an idea of something you would love, a big question, a big thing that you'd love to have talked about on this podcast, email me, josh@crosspointbible.org, and I would love to put it in the list and get things going. If we got a lot of questions, we might end up taking a few podcasts doing it. But right now, it's supposed to be the end of each month. So today, we're going to be looking into a movement that has been shaking up the evangelical world over the past 4 to 5 years, maybe even a little bit longer. And it's this idea of deconstructing your faith. In other words, deconverting. Now, not everybody who does this deconstruction ends up deconverting or saying they're not Christians anymore, but a lot of them have, and some of the most notable names have done it. And I want to be clear as we enter into this discussion, I do not have the authority, nor do I desire to judge a person's heart or soul. However, as a Christian and pastor, I have been given the calling to judge a person's message according to the scriptures. So that's what I'm going to do today. I'm not going to make any definitive statements on whether or not these people were, quote-unquote, real Christians. That's not the point of this, and I don't have insight into whether they truly believed or not prior to their deconversion, because this could just be a lull and they could come back to the faith or whatever. So I don't have that eternal perspective. It would be disingenuous for me to do so. We can get into eternal security in a different podcast, but it's better to talk about eternal security without examples rather than with examples because, like I said, we are finite people and do not know what God is doing in the lives of individuals. For now, today, I want to take a look at this movement and talk about what it is, what it isn't, some common themes, and some holes with this movement's theology. And it is a theological movement. I full-heartedly believe that. So what is deconstruction? For those of you that don't know what deconstruction is, this is what it is. According to John Williamson, he hosts a podcast called the Deconstructionist Podcast. Deconstructionist Podcast, you can just Google it, you'll find a bunch of them. He says this: it's examining your faith from the inside, looking for potential weaknesses. The analogy I like to use is, before you set sail on a cruise ship, you'll see it in harbor and people applying a fresh coat of paint, sealing up any gaps and dealing with the rust. This is done so it doesn't sink once you get out to sea. And that's essentially the same thing that we're saying about faith. It's about taking ownership over what you believe and potentially letting go of some of the things that no longer work. Now, I don't have a huge issue with this post. I think people should be examining their faith. I think Scripture says we should work out our salvation. I think reason is a very appropriate tool to use in accordance with Scripture to understand our faith. I think doubt is actually a decent motivator in knowing what we believe. But I encourage people to examine their faith and do it honestly. Know what you're doing, what you're looking for, what your end goal is. The problem with this deconstructionist movement is that is the definition. But as you look into these stories, I see a problem, a disconnect between this definition and what is actually going on in these deconstruction stories. It's not an actual honest look. Now, they might think it is. Again, I'm not attributing motive. I think some of this is subconscious, but it's not an actual honest look at honest questions about the faith. There is an undercurrent that pulls you out of the faith rather than driving you into having a faith that won't sink, as he claims it should do here. He also claims that faith is like a sweater that becomes frayed, and once you start pulling on a few strings, it just starts to unravel completely until you're completely naked. And that's what he's getting at, is as you deconstruct, you can deconstruct this whole thing, and then you can put the sweater back together in a way that makes sense. More and more very popular Christian icons in our culture are starting to deconstruct their faith, and ultimately, in some cases, move to either a new faith that looks entirely different than Orthodox Christianity, or dismantle any semblance of faith altogether. And today I want to get into why I think the deconstruction premise is flawed, why I don't think it's actually an honest way to ask questions about the faith. And I want to be very clear, I encourage questions about the faith. We ought to ask honest questions. There is room for doubt. Today I want to get into why I think that it is flawed, and what fatal mistake and theological reasoning most of the people that are in this movement are making. First, there's some names of popular people that have just deconstructed their faith, either in whole or in part. And while deconversion is not a new phenomenon in the church, this form of it seems relatively novel, and that's why it's important to discuss. And some of these names you may have heard of, some of them you haven't. This is not an exhaustive list. If it was, it wouldn't necessarily be all that concerning, because there's not a lot of names that I came up with on my own right now, but these are just some names that stood out to me. Bart Campolo, the son of Tony Campolo, who is a popular Christian speaker, and is controversial in a lot of ways. You can look him up. You'll find out why Tony Campolo is controversial. Then you got Joshua Harris, whose curriculum I used for youth group once upon a time, and was a pastor at a very large church, and he has since left the faith and left his wife. Marty Sampson, a worship leader and songwriter for Hillsong United, abandoned his faith. And popular YouTube personalities and former Crew employees, Campus Crusade for Christ, Rhett and Link, released a podcast or three a few months ago detailing their own deconversion story. And that's not an exhaustive list, like I said, but that is the list I'm going with right now. We're going to get into a few of these. Now, first things first, these stories bothered me. When I heard these deconversion stories bothered me, and I couldn't quite put my finger on why, because I'm not particularly interested in Bart Campolo. I never really had been. Not particularly interested in Joshua Harris, even though I used some of his curriculum. I didn't think his Kiss Dating Goodbye book was all that great, even though it was like all the rage when I was in college, and maybe that's why I didn't think it was that great. Marty Sampson, I'm not a huge Hillsong worship fan or Hillsong church fan, and Rhett and Link, I didn't really know much about them. I saw some of their videos. They were kind of funny. I didn't even know they were Christians, really, and so I didn't understand why all this bothered me, and because it wasn't like I was some huge fan of these people, followed their work. It wasn't some cult of personality that I was latching onto here. But I realize it always troubles me when the devil gets a foothold of influence in the church. And this is why I think the deconstruction movement we are seeing in the church today is not the work of actual investigation, trying to reach truth as a conclusion. I do not doubt that many of these people are sincere in their thoughts, that they are doing this honestly. I think, and Rhett and Link is a good example. I listened to all their podcasts. They seem very sincere in what they're saying. I'm not doubting their sincerity, not at all. But I think the problem lies in the accepted presuppositions that have driven them to deconstruct their faith in the first place. Like I said, asking questions, not a problem. But asking questions under the guise of being a blank canvas, and I have a problem, because we all have presuppositions, and acknowledging those presuppositions first before analyzing and before asking questions is of utmost importance if we're actually going to do honest and true investigation of any faith. So as I've looked into each of these stories, I found a common thread in all of them. And it's not the thread that they claim has unraveled their faith. The thread they claim unravels their faith varies. That's kind of the point of the movement. They ask questions that are supposedly unanswerable in the arenas of science, philosophy, etc., and they see if faith can answer them, and, spoiler alert, they find that faith can't answer them, at least not the faith that they currently have. The interesting thing about this movement is that we rarely get to hear from the people who have honestly asked questions and have chosen to continue living in the Orthodox faith, Christian faith, as they were before. And when I use the word Orthodox here, I'm talking about the dogmatic faith positions held by the apostles, early church fathers, ones that evangelical people espouse to, not the denomination of churches like Eastern Orthodox, things like that. Just the basics of the faith. So The claim is that reason or love or justice or what have you was a string they just kept pulling on until their faith unraveled. They had no choice but to leave the faith if they were really going to pursue truth. But as I've looked at their arguments, I have not seen evidence that this is actually the case. I have no doubt in believing that they think this is actually the case, but as I listen to what they say, the words they wrote down or the words they've said on podcasts, I've seen a common thread that we, as a church, must address if we're going to combat this foothold that the devil has placed in churches via influential leaders of the faith leaving the church. And here it is. Without failure, in each case that I have looked at and read through, I've seen the person's willingness, and often, admittedly, an unwitting willingness, to base their genuine search for truth upon naturalistic presuppositions concerning love and justice. What do I mean by that? Well, let me explain a bit, hopefully without getting all too technical. Now, the naturalist, that's one that believes that only the natural world exists. Only the natural world exists. Operates under the presupposition that they have the right to define love and justice morally by what makes sense to their mindset, or to culture at large. In other words, if someone proposes that God is love, they have the right to refute that by changing and manipulating the very meaning of the word love, using the same word that means something completely different. Thus, they can stand in judgment of God's actions while simultaneously claiming that God cannot sit in judgment of their actions. It's like at the end of a college class and you finally get to judge the professor by filling out the evaluation form. This is what deconstruction is. It is looking at God's work and filling out the evaluation form without paying any attention to the syllabus. They've changed the rubric, in many ways subconsciously, to generate an outcome that would condemn God's definition of love and justice. So any pursuit of truth will ultimately leave the pursuit of truth that God offers, because it is a truth that is offered up by culture and by a presupposition in naturalistic mindset and thought. They accept the dominant culture's definition of love, tolerance, and justice as a basis with which to judge their faith. As a filter to judge their faith, their beliefs, scripture, they have redefined love, tolerance, and justice, or allowed love, tolerance, and justice to be redefined for them and accepted those new definitions. No wonder they can deconstruct it. It isn't compatible. And no wonder the answers they are getting don't seem very satisfactory to them. They've completely flipped the rubric. I'll go into some examples here from most of the people that I mentioned in the first place in a second. The second common thread I see is a lack of honesty about the questions they are allowed to ask. And this is, and full disclosure, this is anecdotal, and so they could totally have not been allowed to question their faith or doubt or ask questions as they grew up. That's not my point. As a whole, evangelically, in the Christian community, I disagree with the statements that they were not allowed to ask questions. Both John Williamson and Marty Sampson agree that doubt and questioning your faith is anathema in Christian circles, but it's not. Doubt and questions are encouraged constantly, at least in the traditions that I know and have studied, and certainly in the one I belong to right now. Question away, ask questions, seek answers, seek truth. Now, Williamson said this in an article. He said, "Doubts and questions mean disrespect, and those are the seeds of evil, so just don't." And I am truly sorry if someone actually said this to him or intimated that to be the case. I'm truly sorry about that there was some sort of spiritual rift where people were cajoling others with the club of Scripture by saying, don't question my authority. Don't question anything about God. Just sit, be still, and be good. Now, perhaps he means dishonest questions, but I don't think so. I think he means honest questions. Honest questions are the things the church has thrived on since the beginning. We had councils in the early Christian church to ask honest questions about what we believe and if it is really real. And we shouldn't confuse the emotional response to asking those questions as a response in saying those questions ought not to be asked. Because difficult questions will bring about a difficult reaction, but not a reaction that would claim you do not have the right to ask those questions. In his Instagram post that went viral, Marty Sampson said that believers don't talk about tough issues, fallen preachers, lack of miracles, biblical contradictions. God is love, but he sends people to hell, and that seems to be the biggest one. Rhett and Link bring up objections about Christianity's devotion to young Earth and the evidence for evolution. Rhett even brings up Francis Collins, who, by the way, is a Christian, as to why that theory stopped making sense to him. As if you can only be a young Earth creationist and believe in Jesus Christ. But here's the deal. All of those above reasons are just smokescreens. They're just symptoms for the actual thing that's happening in these stories. But here's the deal. All of the above are just smokescreens for the actual thing that's happening in these stories. You want to question the creation narrative, the 6 days. That's something that's been going on in Orthodox Christian circles for literally centuries. People are encouraged to ask those questions. However, ultimately, I think that Link actually hits the nail on the head when he said this in an interview with Philip DeFranco on YouTube. Link of Rhett and Link said this. I remember when I met Michael Buckley for the first time. He gave me a hug. And I remember thinking at the time, this is the first openly gay person I have ever hugged. And I don't know. I know what I'm supposed to believe about this guy that I'm hugging, but it was a crisis moment for me. It didn't feel right for me to render judgment of him because what I wanted to do was hug him back and actually mean it. But the belief that I was ingrained with didn't allow me to sincerely hug the guy. That is sad. The obvious response to this statement is, why couldn't you hug him sincerely as a Christian? That's just bad theology. And perhaps you got some bad theology to say we cannot love people. We cannot love gay people because we're Christians. That's completely antithetical to the actual Orthodox Christian worldview. To say that we condemn people to hell because they are gay is a complete misread of Scripture and of the actual Orthodox position. People are condemned to hell because that's our state. So the common outcome of these deconstructions is this: it's comfort. And not just comfort in general, but comfort with culture at large. We are now acceptable people according to the dominant world narrative. We have achieved comfort and peace. Marty Sampson said he was at peace with the world in his Instagram post. Rhett and Link found tumult in their decision, but ultimately they found comfort and acceptance in the wider world. They have 16 million subscribers. In the wider world, they have found more acceptance and more comfort because now they can hug Michael Buckley and say that it is authentic because there is nobody telling him that's a sin. I hug sinners all the time. I've been hugged as a sinner all the time. John Williamson said this concerning his own deconstruction story. He said, on one side of your mouth, we're preaching all loving and his love is unconditional. There's nothing that you need to do to be given his gift of unconditional love. And then out of the other side of our mouth, we're preaching you are born a terrible person and Jesus had to die. God had to allow this to happen in order for you to be forgiven. I had a hard time reconciling the two. Why did he have a hard time reconciling the two? There's two reasons. A presupposition about what love is and a desire for comfort. Is it uncomfortable for us to hear that people will go to hell? Yes. Is it unjust for God to send people to hell? No. Is it unloving for God to send people to hell? No. Is loving simply condoning every person's lifestyle and accepting all behavior? No, it's not. And people know this to be the case. I have a house. I have a home. Is it loving and is it just to leave my door unlocked and let whoever wants to come into my home regardless of what they believe about me? Or is it possible that because it is my home, the most loving thing for me to do for the people in my family is to have a standard by which someone ought to be able to enter my home? Is it possible that love must be accompanied by justice and grace must be accompanied by wrath? You didn't need to reconcile the two ideas, Mr. Williamson. They are, in fact, the same idea. God's home is heaven, to be with him. And so Jesus says, I tell you the truth, I'm going to my Father's house, and in his house there are many rooms, and I will prepare a room for you. He is saying, I'm going to let you into my home. He has the ability to decide how he is going to let people into his home, and he has decided that the way he's going to let people into his home is to die for them, and if they believe in him, if they say he exists, if they love him, if they believe in him, then they can be let in. So how do we combat this area of deconstruction? Well, there's a few ways. In my opinion, there's a few ways. We must hold unswervingly to the definition of truth and love that God gives. We must understand that the presuppositions that the world is working with are not the presuppositions of truth that for centuries humankind worked with. Be better at articulating this early and often. Number 2, encourage questions. Don't discourage them. Be willing to live with the tension of someone believing a bit differently about some doctrines and opinions that you hold. 3, do not confuse the desire for comfort as the desire for fulfillment. We are called to live lives of discomfort, not lives of comfort. So ultimately, what this deconstruction does, and what people are doing in this deconstruction, is they are exchanging the truth of God for a lie to feel comfort, and under the guise of searching for truth. Because ultimately, that's what it was. When I listened to each of these stories, it was not about actual truth, regardless of what would happen. Because one of the things that Rhett and Link said was, if they had stayed living in the Bible Belt, they would not have left the faith. Well, truth is truth regardless of where you're at, and asking questions are asking questions regardless of where you're at. So why is that the case? So be on the lookout for more things in the future and know what you believe. Let me know if this didn't make any sense, or if you have questions about anything in particular. You can send them to me at josh@crosspointbible.org. I will address them early on in the podcast next week if I do get questions or statements of clarification. The Stuw is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play Music, YouTube, and our church app and website. Please like, rate, subscribe, and share if you like to. And as always, let me know if you have any questions or comments as well. And we will see you in the Stuw next week.